The 1970s were supposed to be the end, the death of an era. Insurance companies wanted blood, the government wanted compliance, and the oil crisis wanted surrender. But before the lights went out on American muscle, there was one final furious decade where power and danger walked hand in hand. These weren't the refined machines of today. They were raw, unforgiving beasts that could kill you as quickly as they could thrill you. Today, we're counting down 12 most dangerous muscle cars out of the 1970s, the last warriors of a dying breed that refused to go quietly into the night. Number 12, the 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner 440 six-pack. The Roadrunner was never meant to be subtle, and the 1970 version with the 440 six-pack took that philosophy to its violent conclusion. Under the hood sat Chrysler's legendary 440 cubic inch V8, topped with 3 two-barrel carburetors that fed this beast a constant diet of high-octane fury. It churned out 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to light up those rear tires from a standstill through second gear without even trying. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, and that was with street tires that had all the grip of hockey pucks on ice. What made this car dangerous wasn't just the power, it was the chassis. Plymouth built the Roadrunner on their B-body platform, which was designed more for cruising than carving corners. The suspension was soft, the steering was slow, and the brakes were drums all around unless you ponied up for the optional front discs. That meant stopping distances were measured in football fields, not feet. The weight distribution was heavily nose forward, which made the front end plow in corners like a freight train that had missed its exit. But punch the throttle mid-turn, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The back end would step out, and you'd be sideways before your brain could process what was happening. The Roadrunner demanded respect and punished hesitation. It was a cartoon character's name on a car that could put you in a very real hospital. The triple carburetors meant tuning was a constant battle, and when one of those carbs wasn't pulling its weight, the engine would stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The six-pack setup was temperamental in cold weather, prone to flooding, and required constant adjustment to keep all 3 carburetors working in harmony. When everything was dialed in perfectly, the Roadrunner was a straight-line monster. But perfection was rare, and that unpredictability made an already dangerous car even more lethal. Number 11, the 1971 Dodge Challenger RT 440. Dodge's answer to the Mustang and Camaro was bigger, meaner, and more willing to bite than either of its competitors. The 1971 Challenger RT came with the 440 cubic inch Magnum V8 as its top engine option, pumping out 370 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. That was after the new SAE net horsepower ratings kicked in, which meant these numbers were actually conservative. This thing could move. 0 to 60 came in around 6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the low 14 seconds. But the Challenger was heavy, for 3,600 pounds, and that weight came with consequences. The steering was vague and slow, which meant you had to anticipate corners rather than react to them. Wait too long to turn in, and you'd be plowing straight into whatever was on the outside of the curve. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant companion during hard launches. Get on the power too aggressively and the rear end would skip and hop like it was trying to shake itself loose from the chassis. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially if you had the front disc option, but they still weren't up to the task of repeatedly hauling this beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fades set in quickly, and that meant your stopping distances grew longer just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Challenger dangerous was its size. It felt massive on the road, and threading it through traffic or down a narrow street required constant attention. But that massive presence made you feel invincible, right up until physics reminded you that weight and momentum are forces that don't care about your confidence level. The long hood and short deck proportions meant visibility was compromised, especially when backing up or changing lanes. You were piloting a battering ram with limited sightlines, and that made everyday driving more hazardous than it should have been. The Challenger also suffered from typical Mopar electrical gremlins, gauges that lied, warning lights that flickered, and systems that worked when they felt like it. That unreliability added another layer of danger to an already unpredictable machine. Number 10, the 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 LS6. This was the pinnacle, the absolute peak of Chevrolet muscle before everything came crashing down. The Chevelle SS with the LS6 454 cubic inch V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. But everyone knew those numbers were lies. Conservative estimates put the real output closer to 500 horses, and dyno tests proved it. This engine was so powerful that Chevy only offered it for 1 year because it was too much, too brutal, too dangerous. The LS6 could propel the Chevelle from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds and through the quarter mile in the high 13s. Those were numbers that would still be respectable today. And this was 1970. But all that power came without any of the safety nets we take for granted now. No traction control, no stability management, no anti-lock brakes. Just you, a steering wheel, and 500 horsepower trying to kill you. The Chevelle's chassis was competent for the era, but it wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The rear suspension would squat under hard acceleration, loading the rear tires until they finally gave up and turned into smoke machines. The front end would lift, making steering light and vague right when you needed precision most. And the brakes, even with the optional front discs, were marginal at best for a car that could reach speeds where mistakes became catastrophic. What made the LS6 Chevelle truly dangerous was its accessibility. It looked like any other Chevelle on the road, which meant people underestimated it constantly. And that led to a lot of street races that ended badly, a lot of show-offs that ended in ditches, and a lot of legends about the car that was too powerful to survive. The LS6 engine was also notoriously difficult to keep in tune. The solid lifter cam required regular valve adjustments, the carburetor needed constant tweaking, and the ignition system was temperamental at best. When everything was working perfectly, the LS6 was a weapon, but perfection was fleeting, and that meant you never quite knew if you were getting full power or if the engine was going to stumble at the worst possible moment. The cowl induction hood scoop fed cold air directly to the carburetor, which was great for power, but also meant water could get sucked into the engine during heavy rain. More than one LS6 owner learned that lesson the hard way, with a hydrolocked engine and a massive repair bill. Number 9. The 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Super Duty 455. By 1974, the muscle car era was supposed to be over, dead, buried under a mountain of emissions regulations and insurance premiums. But Pontiac had one last ace up their sleeve, the Super Duty 455. This was a 7.5-liter monster that officially made 290 horsepower. But those were the new SAE net ratings that measured power, with all accessories attached and exhaust restrictions in place. The reality was far more violent. The Super Duty 455 was an honest-to-goodness race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced the EPA to let them sell to the public. It featured forged pistons, a high-lift cam, special heads, and an attitude that said emissions regulations could go to hell. Only around 1,000 were built, which made them instant legends. The Trans Am could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, which was astonishing for a car built in the middle of the malaise era. But it was also astonishing how willing this car was to swap ends on you. The Super Duty's massive torque curve meant power was available everywhere, and that meant the rear tires were constantly on the edge of breaking loose. The chassis was the same as the standard Trans Am, which meant it wasn't really designed to handle this much thrust. The steering was slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. Get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so violently that only experienced drivers could catch it before the car was facing the wrong direction. The Super Duty Trans Am was Pontiac's middle finger to everyone who said performance was dead, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. The engine required premium fuel at a time when the gas crisis made premium hard to find and expensive to buy. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would ping and knock like it was trying to tear itself apart. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and the Rochester Quadrajet carburetor was finicky at best. This wasn't a car you could just jump in and drive. It required maintenance, attention, and a constant awareness that you were piloting something that demanded respect. Number 8. The 1970 Plymouth Hemikuda. The Hemikuda was the stuff of legend, even when it was new. Plymouth took their already aggressive Barracuda platform and stuffed it full of the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 an engine so powerful it required its own hood with a massive scoop just to clear the air cleaner. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but those numbers were as conservative as a church sermon. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses, and everyone knew it. The Hemikuda could blast through the quarter-mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. That was supercar territory in 1970, and Plymouth did it with an engine that was essentially a race motor, with turn signals bolted to it. But the Hemikuda was dangerous precisely because it was so powerful. The chassis simply wasn't designed to handle this kind of output. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration. The front end would lift so high that steering became a suggestion rather than a command. And the brakes were woefully inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. Add in the fact that the Hemi required constant tuning, those dual 4-barrel carburetors were temperamental at best, and you had a car that could stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased, which made the car plow in corners until you lifted off the throttle. But lift mid-corner, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward, the rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting a drift whether you wanted one or not. Only about 650 Hemikudas were built in 1970, which made them rare even when new. Today they're worth millions, but back then they were just dangerous street cars that separated brave drivers from survivors. The Hemi engine was also expensive to maintain. It required specialized knowledge to tune properly, and parts were expensive even when new. The dual Carter AFB carburetors needed to be synchronized perfectly, and the mechanical lifters required regular valve adjustments. The cooling system was marginal at best, which meant the Hemi ran hot in traffic and could overheat if you weren't careful. And the fuel consumption was apocalyptic. Single-digit miles per gallon was normal, which made driving a Hemikuda an expensive proposition even before you factored in the inevitable speeding tickets and insurance premiums. Number 7. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wasn't known for building muscle cars, which made the GSX all the more shocking. This was Buick's declaration that they could build something just as brutal as anything from Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet. Under the hood sat the 455 cubic inch Stage 1 V8, which officially made 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. That torque number was staggering. It was more than the Hemi, more than the LS6, more than anything else on American roads in 1970. And you felt every single pound-foot of it. The GSX could rip through the quarter mile in the high 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply refused to be denied. The steering was slow and vague, typical of GM's A-body platform, and the brakes were marginal at best. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than performance, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. But the real danger was that torque. Plant your foot and the GSX would squat on its rear suspension, load up those rear tires, and then launch forward with a violence that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The rear end would step out under hard acceleration, and correcting it required quick hands and quicker thinking. The GSX looked understated compared to cars like the Roadrunner or Challenger. It came in wild colors like Apollo White and Saturn Yellow, but the basic shape was still a Buick. That understated appearance meant people underestimated it, and that led to a lot of surprised faces and even more surprised insurance adjusters. Only about 678 GSX models were built in 1970, making them rare and valuable today. But back then, they were just Buicks that could kill you. The Stage 1 engine was built for low-end torque, which meant it pulled like a freight train from idle, but ran out of breath at higher RPM, or revolutions per minute. That power delivery encouraged drivers to keep the revs low and lean on that torque, which made it easy to overwhelm the rear tires at almost any speed. The automatic transmission was strong but shifted slowly, and there was no manual option, which meant you couldn't use the gears to help control the power delivery. Number 6. The 1971 Plymouth GTX 440+6. Plymouths had been around since the late 60s, but the 1971 version represented the last gasp of real power before emissions controls strangled everything. The top engine was the 440+6, which used 3 2-barrel carburetors to feed 485 cubic inches of angry V8. It made 385 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to make the GTX genuinely fast. The quarter-mile came in the mid-13s, and 0 to 60 took around 6 seconds. But the GTX was big and heavy, tipping the scales at nearly 3,800 pounds. That weight meant the car had serious momentum once it got moving, and changing direction required planning and commitment. The steering was slow, which meant you had to anticipate corners and turn in early. Wait too long and you'd understeer straight into whatever was on the outside of the turn. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially with the optional front discs, but they still struggled to haul this beast down from high speeds. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few hard applications. The real danger with the GTX was its power delivery. Those 3 carburetors meant the engine had a progressive power curve, docile at low throttle openings, violent at full throttle, and the transition between the two could be abrupt. Roll into the throttle mid-corner, and everything would be fine until the outboard carburetors kicked in. Then suddenly you'd have way more power than traction. The rear end would step out, and you'd be fighting to keep the car pointed in the right direction. The GTX was a gentleman's muscle car, refined, comfortable, and capable of genuine violence when provoked. The interior was plush by muscle car standards, with comfortable seats and a full complement of gauges. But that luxury made it easy to forget what you were driving, and that forgetfulness led to mistakes. The air grabber hood scoop was driver activated, which meant you could be cruising along peacefully and then flip a switch to feed cold air directly to those 3 hungry carburetors. The sudden power increase when the air grabber opened could catch you off guard, especially if you were already near the limits of traction. Number 5, the 1970 Oldsmobile 442W30. Oldsmobile's answer to the muscle car wars was the 442, and the W30 package turned it into something genuinely dangerous. Under the hood sat a 455 cubic inch V8 that made 370 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. That torque figure was monstrous, and it arrived low in the rev range, which meant the W30 could pull like a freight train from almost any speed. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, and 0 to 60 took just over 6 seconds. But the real story was how this car delivered its power. The 455 was smooth and linear until you buried the throttle. Then it transformed into something violent, lighting up the rear tires and sending the car hurtling forward with a force that could catch you completely off guard. The chassis was typical GM A body, competent but not exceptional. The steering was slow and offered little feedback. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than handling, and the brakes were adequate at best. The W30 package added some stiffer springs and better shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic limitations of a platform designed for cruising, not carving corners. What made the W30 dangerous was its refinement. It didn't look or feel like a wild muscle car. The interior was plush, the ride was comfortable, and the engine was smooth at cruising speeds. But that civilized demeanor could lull you into a false sense of security. Then you'd put your foot down, the rear end would break loose, and you'd suddenly remember that this was still a car with 500 pound-feet of torque and mediocre tires. The Oldsmobile nameplate also meant that a lot of these cars ended up with older buyers who wanted performance, but weren't necessarily equipped with the skills to handle it. That combination led to more than a few expensive mistakes. The W30 came with a functional hood scoop that fed cold air to the carburetor, but it also collected water during rain, which could cause the engine to stumble. The turbo-hydromatic transmission was strong and reliable, but it shifted lazily unless you manually held gears, which most drivers never learned to do. The rear-end gearing was tall for highway cruising, which meant the car was docile at low speeds but came alive once you got moving. That split personality made it easy to underestimate the W30's capabilities, right up until you found yourself sideways on a wet road. Number 4, the 1971 Pontiac GTO Judge 455 HO. The Judge had been Pontiac's wildest GTO since 1969, and the 1971 version with the 455 HO engine was the final, furious expression of that philosophy. The 455 cubic inch V8 made 335 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque by the new SAE net ratings, but the real output significantly higher. This engine was a torque monster that could pull like a tractor from idle to redline. The Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds, but it weighed over 3,700 pounds. which meant it had momentum that simply couldn't be denied. The styling was deliberately outrageous. Bright colors, bold graphics, and a massive rear wing that looked like it belonged on a race car. But that aggressive appearance couldn't hide the fact that the chassis was struggling to contain all that power. The steering was slow and vague, typical of Pontiac's A-body platform, and the suspension was soft enough that body roll was dramatic in any kind of spirited driving. The brakes were marginal, especially for a car this heavy and this fast. Fades set in quickly during hard use, and stopping distances grew longer just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Judge dangerous was the disconnect between its appearance and its actual capabilities. It looked like a race car, which made drivers believe it could handle like one. But the reality was far different. This was a straight-line brute that could get loose in a hurry if you pushed it in the corners. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration, and the rear end could step out violently if you got on the power too early coming out of a turn. The Judge was Pontiac's way of going out with a bang, and it did so with style and danger in equal measure. The 1971 model year would be the last for the Judge package, and the last year you could get the big 455 engine in a GTO. Pontiac knew the end was coming, and they didn't hold anything back. The Judge came standard with a Ram Air hood scoop, but unlike earlier versions, this one wasn't functional. It was purely for show. That meant the engine was breathing through a restrictive air cleaner, which cost power, but was necessary to meet emissions standards. Still, even detuned and restricted, the 455 made enough torque to overwhelm the chassis and terrify the unprepared. Number 3, the 1970 Chevrolet Corvette LS 5454. The Corvette had always been America's sports car, but the 1970 version with the LS 5454 engine was more muscle car than sports car. That massive 7.4-liter V8 made 390 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the Corvette from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds. The quarter mile came in the high 30s. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with serious consequences. The Corvette's fiberglass body meant it was relatively light at around 3,300 pounds, but the chassis dynamics were primitive by modern standards. The rear suspension used a solid axle until 1963, and even the independent setup on the C3 could be unpredictable. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased because of that massive engine, which meant understeer was a constant companion. But lift off the throttle mid-corner, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose and you'd be in a drift whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick but not particularly communicative, which meant you didn't always know what the front tires were doing until it was too late. The brakes were 4-wheel discs, which was better than most muscle cars of the era, but they still struggled with fade during hard use. What made the LS5 Corvette truly dangerous was its power-to-weight ratio. With nearly 400 horsepower in a relatively light chassis, this car could accelerate hard enough to surprise even experienced drivers. The rear end would break loose without much provocation, especially in the wet, and catching a slide required skill and quick reflexes. The Corvette attracted drivers who saw themselves as skilled enthusiasts, but the car had a way of exposing the difference between confidence and competence. More than a few LS5 Corvettes ended up wrapped around trees or backwards in ditches, driven by people who thought they could handle the power, but learned otherwise. The low seating position and long hood meant forward visibility was compromised, and the thick rear pillars created massive blind spots. The fiberglass body was also fragile. A minor fender bender that would barely dent a steel-bodied car could crack and shatter fiberglass, leading to expensive repairs. And because the Corvette was seen as a driver's car, a lot of people pushed it harder than they should have, learning too late that looking like a sports car and handling like one weren't the same thing. Number 2, the 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 429 Super Cobra Jet. Mercury's muscle car entry was often overlooked next to its Ford and Mopar rivals, but the Cyclone spoiler, with the 429 Super Cobra Jet, was absolutely lethal. This engine was Ford's big block beast, a 7-liter V8 that officially made 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. But like most muscle car ratings of the era, those numbers were conservative lies designed to keep insurance companies happy. Real output was closer to 425 horses, and the torque peak was even more underrated. The Cyclone could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. It was built for NASCAR homologation, which meant the aerodynamics were actually pretty good for the era. The nose and tail were shaped to cheat the wind, and at high speeds, the Cyclone felt more planted than most muscle cars. But that didn't make it safe. The Cyclone was heavy, nearly 3,900 pounds, and that weight came with serious momentum. Once this car got moving, it wanted to keep moving in a straight line. Changing direction required planning, commitment, and a healthy respect for physics. The steering was slow and offered almost no feedback, which meant you were constantly guessing at what the front tires were doing. The suspension was tuned for high-speed oval stability, not corner carving, which meant body roll was dramatic and handling was vague. The brakes were barely adequate for normal driving, let alone for hauling this beast down from the triple-digit speeds it could easily reach. Fade was a constant concern, and stopping distances were measured in optimism rather than feet. What made the Cyclone spoiler dangerous was its rarity. Because so few were built, most people had never driven one and didn't know how to handle one. That unfamiliarity, combined with massive power and mediocre chassis dynamics, led to a lot of expensive lessons. The Super Cobra jet engine was also temperamental, requiring constant tuning to keep it running right. When it was happy, it was a monster. When it wasn't, it would stumble and surge at the worst possible moments, like mid-corner when you were already on the edge of traction. The Cyclone also suffered from typical Ford build quality issues of the era. Squeaks, rattles, and trim pieces that fell off. That lack of refinement extended to the chassis, which felt loose and flexed noticeably under hard cornering. The rear leaf springs would wind up under hard acceleration, storing energy that would release violently when the tires finally broke loose. And the solid rear axle meant wheel hop was a constant problem during aggressive launches. Number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Hemikuda convertible. At the top of our list sits the rarest, most dangerous, and most valuable muscle car of the 1970s, the Hemikuda convertible. Only 7 of these were built in 1970, which makes them unicorns today. But back then, they were just insanely powerful convertibles that could kill you if you didn't respect what you were sitting in. Under the hood sat the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, making 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were fiction. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the Hemi's torque curve was as flat and brutal as a baseball bat to the head. The Hemikuda convertible could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today, and this was 1970 with bias ply tires and no electronic aids whatsoever. But add in the fact that this was a convertible, which meant the chassis had less structural rigidity than the hardtop, and you had a recipe for disaster. The body would flex under hard acceleration or during aggressive cornering, which made the handling even more unpredictable than it already was. The steering was vague, the suspension was overwhelmed, and the brakes were laughably inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. The Hemi engine required constant attention. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors needed regular tuning, and when they weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and surge. That unpredictability was dangerous when you were already trying to manage 500 horsepower through tires that had maybe half the grip of modern rubber. The convertible top also meant visibility was compromised when it was up, and wind buffeting was severe when it was down at high speeds. What made the Hemikuda convertible the most dangerous muscle car of the 70s was the combination of insane power, compromised structure, primitive chassis dynamics, and absolute rarity. These cars were so expensive and so rare that most owners didn't drive them hard enough to learn their limits. And when they did, the results were often catastrophic. The Hemikuda convertible represented the absolute peak of American muscle. Powerful, beautiful, rare, and willing to kill you without a moment's hesitation if you made a mistake. Today, they're worth millions and sit in climate-controlled garages, but back in 1970, they were street-legal race cars that demanded respect and punished anything less. This was the ultimate expression of the muscle car era's philosophy. Maximum power, in a package that expected you to be skilled enough to handle it and didn't particularly care if you weren't. The convertible top mechanism added weight and complexity, and it was prone to leaking when it rained. The rear window was plastic that yellowed and cracked over time, further compromising visibility. And because this was a convertible, the cowl shake and chassis flex were noticeable even during normal driving. Push the car hard and the entire body would twist and flex, making the handling completely unpredictable. The Hemi engine's massive weight also made the front heavy weight distribution even worse in the convertible, as there was less structure in the rear to balance things out. All of these factors combined to create a car that was breathtakingly fast, stunningly beautiful, incredibly rare, and absolutely terrifying to drive at the limit. These 12 machines represented the last hurrah of an era that would never come again. They were built in a time when power mattered more than safety, when performance trumped practicality, and when danger was just part of the package. The insurance companies feared them, the government tried to kill them, and drivers either mastered them or learned painful lessons about the limits of their own abilities. These weren't cars. They were challenges wrapped in steel and chrome, daring you to prove you were worthy. The 1970s saw the beginning of the end, but it also saw some of the most powerful, most dangerous, and most memorable machines ever to wear American badges. These cars taught a generation of drivers that respect wasn't optional. It was survival. They separated the skilled from the lucky, the brave from the foolish, and they left a legacy that still echoes through every muscle car built today. Which of these 70s legends would you be brave enough to drive hard? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories from the decade when muscle cars burned their brightest before the darkness came, hit that subscribe button for more automotive history that refuses to be forgotten.